Speaking about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel groups, various surveys have found, they find the same thing, that African Americans today harbor anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli sentiments at a higher rate than the general population. I find that strange, considering the Jews were at the forefront of the civil rights movement in America in the 60s. And Martin Luther King Jr., as you mentioned, said the Jews have been more sympathetic and have been a better ally to African Americans than any other ethnic group. So given all that, why do you think that blacks in America are more anti-Semitic in general than the general population? Why? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's antithetical, Dr. Bob, but again, I talk about it in my book and I talk about it in my lectures as well, because it's a confluence of different things. What you have, particularly when you get to the 60s, right? And then once again, everything kind of pivots there, right? Dr. King was asked this very question, right? It's called the Rabbinical Assembly. He was the keynote speaker at the what was that time, the 68th Annual Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism, the guest of Rabbi Heschel and the other rabbis that were there. And eerily, I write about in my book, it was 10 days before he was killed, 10 days before he's assassinated. One of his last public addresses is with a room full of rabbis, right? He's at a rabbinical conference. And one of the things that they're talking about, Dr. Bob, is Israel, the Israeli-Arab conflict, anti-Semitism in the black community, this very thing that we're talking about right now, because it was strange, right? The rabbis are saying, Dr. King, can you help us make sense of this? We're hearing anti-Semitism coming from the younger, the Black Panthers, but it was strange to them because they knew obviously what anti-Semitism was. They knew what Jew hatred was. It wasn't new, but they had never heard it coming out of the black community. That's why it was so strange. It was a remarkable question because they're saying, okay, we've never heard this from black people, right? What's going on, Dr. King? So he begins to break it down, and it's a longer answer. He talks about what's going on in the cities versus what's going on in the country, that all the kind of thing. But he begins to talk about, Dr. Bob, how some of it is being stirred up. He talks about this whole, one statement he makes, he says we're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, he said there's a kind of mystique in being colored. In other words, there's some who believe that anything that's not colored is bad. In other words, this whole black is good, white is bad, that whole Marxist thing, this was already happening in the 60s. Yes. Right. So Dr. King was beginning to explain to them, some have this mindset. He said, he said, the vast majority of the civil rights community does not hold to that. We don't believe white bad, black good. We deal with people. That's why the whole content of their character, right? Dr. King.
I love that statement.
So he's explaining this to them and he's talking about it. And so what we find, Dr. Bob, is that once again, going back to the whole Yasser Arafat and the whole disinformation, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and all these things are happening at the same time. While the Arab states are unable to remove the Jewish state, and they're seeing time after time they're losing these battles, right? Israel's fighting these wars, paying a high price, but the Jewish state stands, right? They turn their attention more and more to disinformation and propaganda. And what their weapon of choice was more than any other time was to manipulate a true struggle for justice. That's why Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's a Jim Crow state. They would say these things, and it was for black people of conscience like Bayard Rustin, like A. Philip Randolph, Dr. King's friends who start this pro-Israel organization. They do it for two basic reasons. Number one, they knew Israel was being lied on. The Jewish people were being lied on, right? But they also knew that it was a very dangerous thing when you start calling a democratic state like Israel an apartheid state or a Jim Crow state. Not only is that a lie, but you're not paying attention to what's going on in other parts of the world, right? So the United Nations, in the Arab states, where there's slavery, there's still to this day.
Slavery today.
Millions of slaves in Libya and Mauritania and Saudi Arabia. So this is actually going on. So as you're doing that, you're also, not only are you lying on the Jewish people, not only are you coming against the Jewish state, which is going to stand, it's going to be strong, but it's these other nations that are suffering, they're not being paid attention to. Dr. King begins to explain this in terms of some of what the rabbis are seeing, right? The Angela Davises, the Eldridge Cleavers, right? These are the younger ones of this more radical civil rights movement. Yes. Right. And what's happened is that because of that, there's a scripture in the Christian side of the Bible, so they have this great zeal, right? So they're There's frothing at the mouth. And so what's happening for them, unfortunately, is they're being manipulated. Oh, yeah, you hate the racists and these white people. This is what those Jews are doing to us. These Jews came and they stole our land. And so that becomes part of the talking points with some. Quick, interesting story. Eldridge Cleaver, who was at that time the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers, became a Zionist. I wrote about this in my book. Dr. Bob, short version of that story. I know we're talking here. He gets caught up in a police situation in which he's been accused of having shot a cop I believe in Oakland at the time. He flees from justice and goes to Cuba. And he gets there, Fidel Castro, and they treat him worse than the CIA. He recognizes that all this, stuff, he's like going, okay. So it's a police state the whole time. They're always tapping his phone, the whole thing like that. So he heads to Algeria, because he's already been told that the Arabs are his friends,
yes.
right?
Right, sure.
And especially the Arabs who are anti-Israel, right?
Right.
So he goes there, and now he sees slavery, the slavery you and I are talking about right now.
In Algeria.
Right, in Algeria. He lives this way for 7 years. There's even a famous picture of him and Yasser Arafat holding hands, right? Because they have this big Palestinian rally in Algeria, in Algiers, right? But he lives there, Dr. Bob, and he sees that he's been sold a bill of goods.
I never heard that story.
Dr. Bob, it is an amazing thing.
It's in your book?
It's in my book. I write about my book. Yep. I give the links to it and everything and stuff. And we're going to do some of our videos that are coming out, our content videos. Excellent. Because of your generous gifts, Dr. Bob, we're going to be one by one putting these videos out because people need to know these stories, right? And Dr. Bob, he actually comes back to the United States, surrenders himself to the authorities, becomes a Zionist. He begins to do the research. Not only does he know he's been lied to, he says, not only are the Jewish people not doing what they're accusing him of, they have done more to fight against racism and oppression than any other people. And he talks about whether they're anthropologists, whatever, Jew. He talks about generations of Jews who worked and labored to lay aside all of this. This is bad. These genes are good. These genes are bad type of thing. That he recognizes that not just the Jewish state, which is a beacon of democracy, but the Jewish people. So this Eldridge Cleaver,
I had never heard of this story.
A Zionist, he defends
Israel. Is he alive now?
He passed away in the 1980s, Dr. Bob and everything. But yeah, so he tries to talk to the Angela Davises, these people who are his friends, right? These are all his comrades, right? Yeah. He comes back, he goes, guys, we got it all wrong, right? That whole 7-year saga for him, he returns and recognizes that Israel needs to be defended. The Jews are our friends. We're being lied to. They're trying to destroy America. He becomes very pro-American. The whole thing, Dr. Bob, he gets a baptism by fire, if you will, right? He reckons so when he comes back, Dr. Bob, he becomes part of those black voices standing up and defending Israel because of the experiences. He went through all the radical thing that he went through. Yeah. He came back, and he became still this person who wanted justice, but he began to understand, true justice, right, not this whole bill of goods were being sold, Dr. Bob. So
I never heard that story. That's a great story of redemption. I'm sorry he wasn't more successful.
Yeah. He tried his best, Dr. Bob. He recognized it. He even said he was in, if people want to do, they can Google the article. Reason Magazine did a piece on him a few years before he passed away and everything like that, kind of reflecting on his career and everything like that. He talked about how he did his best to try to turn. He saw how he gotten pulled away, and he tried to, when he get back.
Redeem himself.
He tried to do